Hi, friends. I hope you are doing well. If you are saying to yourself, that guy looks like he needs a haircut, you are right, and you would be in agreement with my wife. The only comment this week was from an A pusher who is trying to make up for having made a bad decision and not taking DE. But I am not only ignoring him for that, I also think that he is a Francisite. Today, we will look at America during the Kennedy and Johnson years. It will involve the civil rights movement making gains in some areas, an American commitment to preventing communism from spreading in Southeast Asia, new and improved rock music, a bold call to put a man on the moon, an attempt to create a great society, failure and success in Cuba, and two assassinations, one a president and the other a civil rights icon. It's Chapter 29. A New Frontier and a Great Society. The election of 1960 pitted two politicians who entered the House of Representatives together in the midterm elections of 1946. We have discussed Richard Nixon, who was elected to the House from California and then the Senate in 1950, before being selected as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president in the election of 1952. While there was talk about dropping Nixon from the ticket in 1956, he was nominated again and became the obvious choice to run as the Republican candidate in 1960. His opponent came from a wealthy, famous, politically connected family in Massachusetts. He had earned a Purple Heart for his service in World War II, and after 3 terms in the House of Representatives, won a Senate race in 1952. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1957 and was not the obvious choice to be the Democratic nominee in 1960. One interesting thing about this election compared to the election of 2020 is the combined age of the candidates. Kennedy and Nixon's combined age on election day, 90. The combined age of President Trump and Joe Biden, who at the time of this recording is the presumptive Democratic nominee on election day 2020, 151. These candidates engaged in the first televised presidential debates in American history. Those that watched the first debate on TV thought that Kennedy won, and those that listened on the radio thought that Nixon won. Kennedy's ability to effectively project his youth on television had an impact. It also did not help that Nixon had been in the hospital for 2 weeks before the debate, so he did not project as well as Kennedy. 66 million Americans watched the debate. And Kennedy won a tight election in the Electoral College, becoming the 35th U.S. president. Kennedy was the youngest man elected president at 43 years old. The list of youngest presidents includes Teddy Roosevelt, who was 42 when he became president following the assassination of William McKinley. It would be 45 when he was elected in 1904. Kennedy, Bill Clinton, who was 46 when he was inaugurated in 1993, Ulysses S. Grant, who was 46 in 1869, and Barack Obama, who was 47 in 2009. Kennedy's inaugural address is one of the most famous in American history. Here is Kennedy towards the beginning of the speech.
We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
It is important to remember that Kennedy was the first president born in the 20th century and was replacing Eisenhower, who was 70 at the time. The end of Kennedy's speech has the iconic line that most people are familiar with.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
As I've said previously, foreign policy would be the dominant driving force for presidents during the Cold War, and Kennedy was no different. His domestic program was the new frontier. While Democrats controlled Congress, there was a large bloc of conservative Democrats that made passing some of Kennedy's legislation difficult. The Alliance for Progress in Latin America invested American money into Latin America with mixed success. The Peace Corps, one of the more famous Kennedy proposals, committed American volunteers abroad to help build up the Third World. There was an increase of the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25 an hour under John F. Kennedy. There was an increase in Social Security benefits and a dramatic increase in funding for the exploration of space that we'll get to in a few minutes. There were also priorities that did not make it through Congress: federal aid to education, health care for older Americans, and tax cuts. Many of these priorities would later be passed under President Johnson. In foreign policy, it was a bumpy road at first for the Kennedy administration, starting with panic over who would win the space race, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba, and another demand by a leader of the Soviet Union to have American troops removed from West Berlin. This time it ended with a wall being built. As Kennedy took office, the Soviet Union was winning the space race. They had sent the first satellite into space in 1957 with Sputnik, and then on April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to enter space aboard Vostok 1. Just over 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard would become the first American to go into space. The United States was losing the space race, and Kennedy made reaching the moon the ultimate goal at a speech given at Rice University in Houston, Texas in September 1962. He said, "First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and others too. You will have to wait until next time to see how this ends." As I said last time, the Eisenhower administration put together a plan to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. Upon taking office, Kennedy would put this plan into motion, and it would not be successful. 5 days after Yuri Gagarin took his trip into space, the United States launched an invasion at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. The plan called for 1,500 anti-Castro exiles trained in the United States to overthrow Castro. American ships delivered the exiles to the Bay of Pigs, and nothing went as planned. The sought-after mass uprising did not materialize as Castro's forces were waiting for them. The CIA-backed group was outgunned and outmanned the minute they reached the beach. Kennedy elected to not send in air support to help. More than 1,200 rebels were captured, and the new president was humiliated less than 3 months into his presidency. The failed attack increased Castro's profile on the world stage and drove Cuba even more into the arms of the Soviet Union. 2 months later, Kennedy met with Khrushchev in Vienna, where the United States and Soviet Union would once again discuss the status of Berlin. At the summit, Khrushchev demanded that the NATO countries leave West Berlin, going after the president more aggressively than Kennedy had expected. In August 1961, the Soviet Union stopped the flow of people between East and West Berlin and started constructing a 27-mile wall dividing the two parts of the city. There have been thousands of people fleeing East Berlin for West Berlin weekly. The Berlin Wall was designed to stop it. Churchill had spoken of a figurative wall, an iron curtain between the East and the West in 1946. The Berlin Wall was the literal barrier that symbolized the Cold War until it came down in 1989. Kennedy would give a famous speech at the wall in 1963, where he famously said, "Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner." The United States responded by dramatically increasing the United States' missile arsenal, adding more than 250,000 new troops to the military, and creating the Green Berets to provide a more flexible response when one was needed. To many, Kennedy looked weak next to the leader of the Soviet Union. The disastrous summit in Vienna, paired with Gagarin and the Bay of Pigs, marked a rough start to JFK's debut as the leader of the free world. An opportunity to change people's minds presented itself in Cuba in October 1962. On October 14, 1962, the CIA had analyzed photographs from U-2 spy planes showing the construction of launch sites for Soviet nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, 100 miles from American soil. These missiles could reach American cities, and Kennedy now found himself being tested once again. When Kennedy was told about the photographs 2 days later, it started a 13-day period that brought the world closer to a nuclear war than at any time before or since. On October 22nd, the president went on television and told the American people about the missiles and said, "The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war." Kennedy ordered a quarantine of the island, preventing any ships to get to the island, and warned that it would be the policy of the United States to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Kennedy's ambassador to the UN and former Democratic nominee, twice sacrificed against Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson, challenged the Soviet Union in the UN Security Council, showing the images. On October 24th, Soviet ships heading for Cuba eventually turned back. 2 days later, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly pledged to not invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it was labeled, relieved tension between the United States and Soviet Union and improved Kennedy's standing in the eyes of the world. In August 1963, the two sides signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to restrict atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests. We will transition from foreign policy to talk about the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King sought to end segregation and achieve political equality through nonviolent protest. This had worked in Montgomery in 1955 when King emerged and inspired a movement. There were several ways civil disobedience were used during the Civil Rights Movement. On February 1st, 1960, Joseph McNeil, Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, and David Richmond, all freshmen at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, attempted to order food at the lunch counter at Woolworth and were denied service, as was the custom at the time. The four men refused to get up until they were served. A crowd gathered, and they were told, "This counter is reserved for white people. It always has been, and you are well aware of that. So why don't you go on out and stop making trouble?" They refused and were assaulted verbally. They sat until the store closed, vowing to return the next day. On that next day, 23 students from North Carolina A&T and 4 from Bennett College, a black women's college in Greensboro, went to the same Woolworth and sat without getting served. By the end of the week, there were more than 300 demonstrators at lunch counters across Greensboro. Efforts to negotiate did not lead to change, so these sit-ins continued. These protesters were passive. They did not raise their voices or indulge in name-calling. They were nonviolent and faced verbal and physical abuse and were arrested for trespassing. After a boycott of these stores resulted in a drop in profits, within 6 months, African Americans could walk into a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and be served. Sit-ins would spread across the South and lead to the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Freedom Riders, inspired by James Farmer, the leader of the Congress on Racial Equality's call to challenge segregation in interstate transportation, endured attacks while trying to travel in the South. The Supreme Court had forbade discrimination in interstate passenger transportation in Boynton versus Virginia in 1960. A bus was firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. Some were pulled off of another bus in Alabama and beaten. When they reached Mississippi, they were jailed. In the end, the white and colored signs that were part of terminals in the South would come down. James Meredith had served in the Air Force and sought to enroll in the University of Mississippi. The governor of that state refused to allow Meredith to register. Robert Kennedy, brother of the president and the Attorney General of the United States, had to send federal marshals to help. These marshals were then attacked by a white mob, and the National Guard had to be called in. 2 people died and 12 people were wounded because a black man wanted to go to a public college in the state of Mississippi in 1962. Martin Luther King led nonviolent protests in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 that aligned with the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. The governor of Alabama was George Wallace. The first word that comes to my mind when I think of George Wallace is racist. There were thousands of protesters in Birmingham protesting peacefully. They were not met with anything that resembled peace. It is at this point in the story where we meet Eugene Bull Connor, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham. Connor used fire hoses, attack dogs, and electric cattle prods against the protesters. All of this was seen on television, and it worked to change people's opinions, especially in the North. From a jail cell in Birmingham, King wrote an open letter to those who questioned his tactics. In my opinion, King's letter from Birmingham jail is one of the most eloquent things penned in the last 80 years. Here's a long section that I think is particularly effective. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we stiff creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging dark of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes the N-word, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you go forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. Up to this point, the president has been missing in action. Kennedy's record on civil rights is not a strong one for the first 18 months of his presidency. He seems to spend more time trying to get back to the status quo than trying to bring about real change. Historian Harvard Sitkoff summarizes Kennedy and civil rights perfectly when he writes, in 1961, the Kennedys saw the struggle against racism as a conundrum to be managed, not a cause to be championed. It would not be until June 1963 that Kennedy would call for Congress to pass a new civil rights bill. After Medgar Evers was killed in his front yard within view of his wife and children, Kennedy called a meeting of civil rights leaders at the White House. Part of the reason for Kennedy's seeming paralysis on civil rights was Southern Democrats. If Kennedy was to be reelected in 1964, he would need Southern support, and civil rights was a non-starter for Southerners in the Democratic caucus. It was these Democrats that blocked passage of Kennedy's civil rights bill. In response, King organized the March on Washington that brought 250,000 black and white Americans together to demand action from Congress. It was here that King gave his famed I Have a Dream speech. This showed the power of nonviolent protest and was a powerful counter on television to what Americans saw from officials in Alabama and Mississippi earlier that year. Abraham Zapruder happened to be filming President Kennedy's trip to Dallas on November 22, 1963. In doing so, he captured the fourth assassination of an American president in the nation's history. It was concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. If you are into conspiracy theories, there are none more important or interesting than this one, in my opinion. They involve Russians, Cubans, mobsters, the CIA, the FBI, the vice president, businessmen, the list goes on. We never heard from Lee Harvey Oswald because he was killed by Jack Ruby while in the custody of Dallas police. But let's focus on things that are much clearer. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, was now the president of the United States. Johnson would serve the remainder of Kennedy's term and would manage to get Kennedy's civil rights bill through Congress within 8 months of the president's assassination. Johnson, who had been the Senate Majority Leader before assuming the role of vice president, used the death of Kennedy to convince congressmen to support the legislation, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, gender, and national origin. It made segregation illegal and gave the government the power to integrate schools, no more with all deliberate speed. You can see King there with the president at the bill signing. This was a major victory for the civil rights movement. In the election of 1964, Johnson ran against the Republican senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. During the campaign, Goldwater discussed using nuclear weapons on North Vietnam. Johnson said, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles from home to do what Asian boys ought to be able to do themselves." I can tell you that this will not be Johnson's position by the end of this presentation. Goldwater was a conservative ahead of his time. His influence would be felt in the party in the 1970s and the 1980s. His victories in 5 southern states would start the process of southern states moving towards the Republican Party. In the end, Johnson won in one of the biggest landslides in American history. And we will get to Johnson's Great Society right after this. Here are a few things I just thought you should know. It costs the U.S. Mint almost twice as much to mint each penny in nickel as the coins are actually worth. Taxpayers lost over $100 million in 2013 just through the coins being made. I always knew that pennies were worthless, but even the nickel? Casu marzu is a Sardinian cheese that contains live maggots. The maggots can jump up to 5 inches out of the cheese while you're eating it. So it's a good idea to shield it with your hand to stop them from jumping into your eyes. I don't know what to say about that. And lastly, during World War II, the crew of the British submarine HMS Trident kept a fully grown reindeer named Pollyanna aboard their vessel for 6 weeks. It was a gift from the Russians. A gift from the Russians, huh? Have you ever wondered what happened to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer later in life? Long story short, he was a communist. Red nose? Come on. He was working for Stalin the entire time. You can see the dear leader pictured there on the right, circa 1951. Johnson's domestic vision for the United States was the Great Society. In his first State of the Union in January 1964, he announced a war on poverty, inspired by Michael Harrington's The Other America. To combat poverty, Johnson created the Economic Opportunity Act, which created several programs designed to help the poor. Head Start to help preschool children from low-income families, Vista to get Americans involved in anti-poverty programs, Job Corps to provide educational and vocational training for young people. Congress passed the Food Stamp Act to help the poor buy food. Johnson's Great Society also affected health care with Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare was provided health insurance for the elderly, and Medicaid provides health insurance for the poor. If you have a job, you pay into both of these programs in your paycheck. Civil rights were part of Johnson's Great Society. We already discussed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and we'll get to the Voting Rights Act in 1965 in just a few minutes. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided federal money for education, for professional development, instructional materials, resources to support educational programs, and parental involvement promotion. The Immigration Act in 1965 ended the quota systems that went into place during the nativist period we discussed in the 1920s. It treated all of the world's people equally. The National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities was created. At 6'3.5" tall, Johnson is second only to Abraham Lincoln when it comes to the tallest U.S. president. Johnson had a way of convincing people of his point of view, the Johnson treatment, seen there. Johnson would make his point while invading one's personal space. He was known to be very convincing. Johnson created new cabinet positions through the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Safety standards for cars were created for the first time. There was funding for higher education, public housing, and crime prevention. There is a lot here. It can only be compared to FDR's New Deal. It was a lot of money, which under normal circumstances would be challenging. For Johnson, what would ultimately kill his Great Society would be the war in Vietnam. Here I offer you 3 really effective political cartoons to make my point. In 1964, Mississippi became the focus of civil rights leaders as the issue of voting came to the center. Only 5% of eligible black voters were actually registered in the state. The same weapons used in the wake of the ratification of the 15th Amendment still existed throughout the South: poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. The poll tax was no longer legal following the passage and ratification of the 24th Amendment in 1964. Civil rights activists descended upon Mississippi in the summer of 1964. 1/3 of the activists were women with an average age of 21. Most of them came from the Northeast. Bob Moses, who was the organizer of the Mississippi Freedom Project, said of their goal, "Mississippi has been called the closed society. It is closed, locked. We think the key is in the vote. Any change, any possibility for dissidents and opposition first depends on a political breakthrough." Volunteers were taught the tenets of nonviolent protest and about voter registration laws in Mississippi. They opened dozens of freedom schools to educate African Americans in Mississippi and get them ready to register. They met resistance at almost every level, from the state, local officials, the KKK, and white citizens' councils. Hundreds were arrested, dozens were beaten, churches were burned, and 7 people killed. On June 21st, 1964, James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner disappeared while investigating a church burning. 6 weeks later, their bodies were found. Goodman and Schwerner, who were white, had died by single bullet shots to the chest, while Chaney, who was black, had been beaten with a chain and shot 3 times. Arrests were made in December 1964, and it was determined that the 3 men had been arrested for fictitious charge and were taken to a deserted area where Klansmen awaited their arrival, and they were killed, their car burned, and bodies buried using a bulldozer. Freedom Summer had a big impact for several reasons. It successfully registered around 80,000 people who previously had not been able to vote. Like the events mentioned previously, these actions brought attention to what was going on in the South and helped make the struggle for civil rights more visible to more Americans. But it also led to people starting to question King's methods. The Voting Rights Act made literacy tests illegal and gave the federal government oversight of voter registration in the South. This was designed to make sure all American citizens could vote. 95 years after the 15th Amendment supposedly gave all males the right to vote, and 45 years after the 19th Amendment supposedly gave all citizens the right to vote. In Alabama, 14% of eligible black voters were registered in 1960. That number jumped to 58% by 1968. The chart here provides convincing data demonstrating the impact of the Voting Rights Act. You can see our state, Virginia, at just over 20% of eligible black voters registered in 1960 when John F. Kennedy was elected president, all the way up to 70% in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected. By 1965, Jim Crow was dead legally. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended legal discrimination, almost 100 years after those Reconstruction amendments that were designed to help African Americans in the 1860s and 70s. We call this de jure segregation, meaning by law. By law, in America, segregation was against the law. But there was also de facto segregation, meaning in fact. People were still segregated based on where they lived, how much money they made, and any other number of factors. Just look at the unemployment numbers historically. Even in the year 2019, black unemployment is nearly twice as high as white unemployment. Not that different from what it was at the time of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. In 1970, there were more than 3 times as many black families as white families living in poverty. What we see in the civil rights movement after this point is frustration with a lack of change with regards to the economic situation many black Americans found themselves in. The frustration with the lack of economic change and the mistreatment of nonviolent protesters found a voice in the growing Black Power movement in the 1960s. Black Power focused on poor blacks and appealed to those feeling that frustration. Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were among the most significant voices for Black Power. It was more militant and focused on urban communities that were overwhelmingly poor and black. This would cause a major divide within the civil rights movement. It was most influential in American inner cities. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. His parents attended United Negro Improvement Association meetings. While Louisa Little was pregnant with Malcolm, their home was burned down by Klansmen in 1925. The family moved to Michigan, where their house was also burned down. Earl Little, Malcolm's father, was killed by a streetcar under suspicious circumstances in 1931. When Malcolm's mother was committed to a mental hospital in 1939, Malcolm went to foster care, a juvenile home, and eventually lived with his half-sister in Boston. He was arrested for armed robbery in 1945. During his 7 years in prison, he converted to the Nation of Islam and changed his name to Malcolm X. The Nation of Islam was founded by Elijah Muhammad in Detroit in the 1930s, referring to whites as devils, embracing black nationalism, and calling for a black state. Malcolm X would soon become its most influential spokesman. He rejected the tenets of nonviolent protest, arguing that African Americans had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary, and insisting that the day of nonviolent protest is over. He argued that real African Americans did not want to integrate into this corrupt society, but to separate from it, to a land of our own where we can reform ourselves, lift up our moral standards, and try to be godly. He was very critical of Martin Luther King's tactics, saying, "Real men don't put their children on the firing line." He was also critical of what was actually gained as a result of the civil rights movement, saying, "Imagine you'll have a chance to go to the toilet with white folks." On the March on Washington, Malcolm X said it was run by whites in front of a statue of a president who has been dead for 100 years and who didn't like us when he was alive. Not even Abraham Lincoln escaped Malcolm X's ire. Malcolm X broke from the Nation of Islam in 1964. He was one of the most visible black men in America by that time. After leaving the Nation of Islam, he started talking about the importance of political participation. He returned from a pilgrimage to Mecca, and his rhetoric changed. He did not reject what he had said previously, but he was much more conciliatory. It was at this point that Malcolm X was assassinated by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. During his life, he was hated and feared by much of white America, but he was a hero for many African Americans, especially those living in poor urban areas. Under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, SNCC went from focusing on nonviolence to emphasizing violence and separation of the races. Whites were kicked out of the organization. In Oakland, California, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton founded the Black Panther Party to combat police brutality. This was another rejection of nonviolent protest, as they advocated armed revolt and walked around carrying weapons. The Black Panthers evolved and focused on issues important to African Americans living in American cities. Writing about the Black Panthers, historian Harvard Sitkoff says, although the Black Panthers also initiated free breakfast programs for school children and free health clinics, most whites, dependent on what the media reported, only heard their revolutionary bravado and only saw their bloody shootouts with the Oakland police. There were race riots in the United States and several American cities in the second half of the 1960s. This highlights the disconnect between legal victories in 1964 and 1965 and the reality in American cities. There were 6 days of riots in Los Angeles involving more than 35,000 people. 34 people were killed, around 1,000 were injured, and $40 million in property was damaged. There were tanks and helicopters, making the city seem more like a war zone. Watts is a neighborhood twice as big as Manhattan, and it did not have a single hospital at the time. Newark, New Jersey was 65% black in 1967. In that year, 4,000 National Guardsmen were sent when riots emerged over police brutality. After more than a week, 7,000 people were arrested, more than 2,000 buildings were destroyed, and 25 people were killed. 43 people died as a result of race riots in Detroit in 1967. The Kerner Commission, which was created to investigate the riots, issued a report that called for a $30 billion investment in American cities to be spent on things like public housing, creation of a jobs program, and the desegregation of public schools. The report saw America as becoming 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. I wanted to take a moment to discuss an event where sports crossed over into history. At the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, Americans Tommy Smith and John Carlos finished first and third in the 200 meters. As a sign of protest against civil rights in the United States, they each did several things. Everyone remembers the gloved fist raised during the national anthem, but as you see in this image I took at the Muhammad Ali Freedom Center, one of the best museums on the planet, there is so much more. From Smith's black scarf and socks to Carlos's unzipped jacket and beaded necklace. Even the silver medalist, Australian Peter George Norman, donned an Olympic Committee for Human Rights button on the podium. We will talk about the American action in Vietnam right after this. I wanted to take a minute to tell you about one of the most frustrating shoots I was ever part of for the magazine. My team was in Madagascar shooting the aye-aye. You can see me there in a canoe that I made myself from a baobab tree. I am sure most of you already know this, but for those that don't, the baobab tree is the national tree of Madagascar. While shooting the eye, we encountered one that I named Siknarfiage. In the local dialect, Siknarfiage has several meanings. It can mean creepy, one that makes most people uncomfortable. Look at those paws. It also means one who is most difficult to deal with. You see me having to grab him right there. We could never get him to focus and do what he was supposed to do. He was most irritating. The last time we were in Vietnam, we discussed the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and how the United States supported the Diem regime in the South. A reunification vote was scheduled to take place in 1956. Diem ruled Vietnam as a dictator and was supported by the United States. After Johnson, who was visiting Saigon as vice president, called Diem the Churchill of Southeast Asia, he admitted to journalist Stanley Carnow that he did not mean it and said, "Diem's the only boy we got out there." The Truman administration had supported French efforts to hold on to Vietnam. The Eisenhower administration sent financial aid and advisors. By 1956, only South Korea received more military aid from the United States than South Vietnam. There were 675 military advisors there in 1960 and 16,000 by the time Kennedy was assassinated. Diem was killed by a Kennedy-approved coup in 1963. The leaders that replaced Diem were no better or any more effective. Johnson sent more advisors, but maintained that he did not want a war in Southeast Asia. On August 2, 1964, reports surfaced that the USS Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that the United States had returned fire. The report was not true. The United States had been launching covert operations into North Vietnam and had fired first. It was determined that 3 North Vietnamese died in the event and that the USS Maddox had a single bullet hole from a machine gun. Following a supposed attack on 2 American ships 2 days later, the president addressed the nation. The administration spun these events as unprovoked attacks. They were not. There is a lot of evidence to support the fact that the United States used these incidents to justify a war in Vietnam. Now, this is not the first time that this has happened. I will remind you of how the United States got into a war with Mexico in 1846, or how the United States got into a war with Spain over Cuba in 1898. In response, Congress passed what came to be known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which said, Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. This gave the President a blank check to do whatever was needed to stop the spread of communism into Southeast Asia. As a result, President Johnson dramatically increased the American footprint in Vietnam. A Viet Cong attack on an American base near Pleiku resulted in 100 American casualties. In response, Johnson approved Operation Rolling Thunder, which was the first major bombing campaign of North Vietnam. You can see on the chart there how quickly the number of Americans in Vietnam increased from 23,300 in 1964 to more than 500,000 4 years later. The war effort was led by General William Westmoreland, and he focused on winning a war of attrition by overwhelming the North Vietnamese with superior American firepower. It was not about taking territory. It was about inflicting as many casualties on the enemy as possible. Americans were not trained for this type of war. The dense jungles of Vietnam gave the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese a distinct home field advantage. The ability to move soldiers and supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail between the North and the South was another advantage. Ho Chi Minh's forces were also accustomed to the heat and humidity of the area. Television played a major role in how Americans experienced the Vietnam War. Reporters broadcast from Vietnam, bringing the war into people's living rooms. Nightly body counts increased, and American support for the war would quickly begin to erode. I had mentioned Operation Rolling Thunder earlier. Most of the fighting took place in South Vietnam. This does not mean that North Vietnam did not experience the war, as the United States launched sustained bombing attacks of North Vietnam throughout the war. In the first 3 years of the war, the United States dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than it did during the entire Second World War. The use of napalm gave the bombings a more devastating effect, and Agent Orange, which was used as a defoliant on the jungles, had long-term health effects on the people of North Vietnam. Americans waded through the jungle, launching search and destroy missions with unclear objectives. Also, it was hard to always know who the enemy was, as the Viet Cong did not wear uniforms and blended in. Americans would be unable to win the hearts and minds of the people and earn their support. Philip Caputo, a journalist who had fought in Vietnam, told the following story about fighting the war. Just before the platoon resumed its march, someone found a length of electrical detonating cord lying in the grass near the village. The village would have been as likely an ambush site as any. The Viet Cong only had to press the detonator and then blend in with the civilians, if indeed there were any true civilians in the village. Or they could have hidden in one of the tunnels under the houses. All right, I thought, tit for tat. No ceasefire for us, none for you either. I ordered both rocket launcher teams to fire white phosphorus shells into the hamlet. They fired 4 altogether. The shells, flashing orange, burst into pure white clouds, the chunks of flaming phosphorus arching over the trees. About half the village went up in flames. I could hear people yelling, and I saw several figures running through the white smoke. I did not feel a sense of vengeance any more than I felt remorse or regret. I did not even feel angry. Listening to the shouts and watching the people running out of their burning homes, I did not feel anything at all. The Viet Cong launched a surprise attack on American and South Vietnamese forces across South Vietnam on Tet, Vietnamese New Year. Within a few days, the United States had beaten back the Viet Cong and turned what looked like a defeat into a military victory. The issue was that Americans, watching from home, did not view this as a victory. The president's assessment that the North Vietnamese were weak and that the United States was on the verge of victory seemed unbelievable. The Tet Offensive was a military defeat for North Vietnam, but a psychological defeat for the United States. Support of the war and the president dropped dramatically. In the year 1968, Johnson's approval rating plummeted to 35%. The United States was spending more than $300,000 for each communist killed in Vietnam. Johnson's Great Society was getting $53 a person to combat poverty. The top picture is, in my opinion, a perfect summation of what it's like to be Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Senators Robert Kennedy of New York and Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota launched primary challenges against the sitting president. Johnson went on television 2 months after the Tet Offensive and announced that he would not run for re-election in 1968. There would be a new president in 1969. We will reveal who next time. On April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King gave a speech in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of striking sanitation workers. Here is the ending of what he said.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray, resulting in riots across the country. Next time, we will look at America during the Nixon presidency. Lee and Luke, say goodbye to these fine people.
Goodbye.
Tell your dad he needs a haircut.
Daddy, you need a haircut.
Good night, Albuquerque.